She said it quietly, the way a person says something they have been turning over for a long time. The job's taken, the ring isn't. And he did not know, standing there in the November mud, with his hat in his hands, that those 8 words were about to rebuild everything he had decided to stop hoping for. You are watching a story about what happens when 2 people who have learned to survive alone discover that surviving together is an entirely different thing. Stay with this one. By the way, wherever in the world you're watching from right now, let me know in the comments. I love seeing how far these stories reach. Okay, where were we? A woman named Cora Aldridge stood in the doorway of a farmhouse in the hill country of central Tennessee in the autumn of 1887. And she had 8 words left in her that day, and she spent them all at once on a stranger. That is where this story begins. But to understand what those words cost her, and what they would eventually give back, we have to go further. We have to go back 4 years, to the morning her husband did not come in from the field. Cora had come to the land with her husband, James Aldridge, in the spring of 1879. They had driven a wagon south from Kentucky with $43 between them, a team of 2 mules, and a surveyor's claim on 80 acres of creek-fed bottomland that James's father had bought at courthouse auction and given to them as a wedding present. James was 26. Cora was 22. The land was full of cedar and limestone and a creek that ran clear in summer and turned the color of red clay after rain. And neither of them had ever farmed ground that hard, but they were the kind of young that mistakes persistence for talent and survives by accident. They built the house in the first summer, a 4-room plank structure with a porch that faced east, so the morning light fell across it before the heat did. They broke 5 acres that first year, 10 the second, and by the 3rd year, the place was beginning to look like something a person intended. James died in October of 1883. He was carrying a fence post across the north pasture when his heart simply stopped. He was 30 years old. The county doctor told Cora the condition had likely been there since birth, a wall of the heart that had never formed the way it ought to, and that James had probably felt it as a heaviness behind the breastbone, and had not said so because he was the kind of man who did not name his troubles. Cora thought for a long time after that about all the mornings James had stood at the fence looking out at the creek for longer than the task required, and she wondered whether he had known something she had not, and whether she should have asked. She did not leave. People told her she should. Her sister wrote from Louisville. The Baptist preacher in the nearest town, a settlement called Harlan's Cross, delivered the opinion in the form of a question that was not actually a question. A neighbor, Glenn Pruitt, who ran cattle on the land to the north, offered to buy the 80 acres at a price generous enough to mean he thought he was doing her a favor, and ungenerous enough to show he thought the land was worth more than he said. Cora thanked him and did not sell. She hired a hand for 2 seasons, a 50-year-old man named Elias Boone, who knew drainage and soil and very little else, which was exactly what she needed. When Elias's daughter took sick and he left in the spring of 1886, Cora worked the season with 2 hired boys from town who showed up intermittently and at the pace of people who knew they were not accountable. She got through it. She always got through it. But the 80 acres had grown to include a small orchard, a kitchen garden, a hog pen, 12 head of cattle, and a stand of winter wheat that needed attention the way a child needs attention, constant and specific. By the time October of 1887 came early and cold, Cora understood she needed a capable hand for the coming season, or she was going to lose ground she could not afford to lose. She had placed an advertisement in the Harlan's Cross weekly paper in September. She had received 4 replies. 3 she ruled out in a single conversation. The 4th had not yet appeared. That was the situation on the morning of the 4th of November, 1887, when she heard boots on the porch steps just before first light. She had taken the rifle from beside the door before she opened it. This was not fear so much as habit. The person on the porch was a man, tall, with a good coat that had been good for a long time, a hat held in both hands, and the particular stillness of someone who has learned that arriving at a stranger's door in the dark requires a posture that does not alarm. His name, he said, was Nathaniel Cray. He had come about the hand position. He had traveled 3 days from Middle Georgia after reading the advertisement in a borrowed paper at a boarding house in Chattanooga, and had recognized the description of the land. He said that last part plainly, not with sentiment. He had recognized the description of the land. He had known someone who knew it. Cora lowered the rifle a few inches. She said, "Who?" He said, "Your husband, ma'am." James Aldridge and I worked the same mill the winter of '78 before he came north. He told me about this place, the creek, the limestone shelf on the east slope. He said someday when I was ready to work ground again, I should come up here. He said the land would be worth it. Cora stood in the doorway for a moment with the cold coming around her from both sides. She had not known James had said that to anyone. It was, as she would think about it later, entirely like him, who told strangers the things he did not say at home, because strangers did not carry the words anywhere that mattered. She told Nathaniel to put his horse in the barn. There was a bunk in the tack room, and she would talk to him in the morning. He thanked her without effusion. She watched him lead his horse around the side of the house, and noticed the horse was a good one, a bay mare with sound feet and a quiet eye. A man who keeps a horse well in hard times understands that some things are worth their upkeep. She did not sleep much the rest of that night. She lay in the dark and thought about James, describing this place to a man she had never heard of, talking about the land the way he talked about it to her, only sometimes, when he was tired and easy, and not performing competence. It made her feel, in a way she would not have predicted, both closer to him and further from him at once. She was 30 years old. She had been a widow for 4 years, James dead at 30. She had gotten very good at not counting. In the morning she fed him breakfast, and they talked across the kitchen table for the better part of an hour. Nathaniel Cray was 34. He had farmed in Georgia on shared land until the landowner sold out from under 3 tenant families and left them scrambling. He had no wife, no children, no fixed debts that he named. He spoke without elaboration and answered questions directly and did not volunteer more than was asked, which Cora found useful because it meant she could take what he said at face value. She had interviewed enough men to know that the ones who talked too much about themselves were usually decorating over something. Nathaniel Cray talked about work. She asked what he wanted for wages. He named a figure that was fair. Not low, not high, fair, which suggested he had thought about it before he named it. She told him she would give him the bunk, 3 meals, and the figure he named, plus 10% of the wheat yield above a baseline she set, which she had learned from Elias Boone kept a hand interested past March. He considered it for a moment and said that was agreeable. She handed him a list with 17 items on it. He read it without comment and then asked about the drainage on the south field, whether the low corner had standing water in wet springs. She told him it did. He nodded and looked back at the list. That was the moment she understood he was going to be useful. He started that morning. By the time the light left the sky, he had repaired the hog pen fence, cleared the drainage ditch on the south field's low corner, restacked the woodpile against the barn wall so it would season properly, and begun an inventory of the root cellar she had been meaning to finish for 3 weeks. She watched from the kitchen window more than she would have admitted. That is the refrain that belongs to this story, and it is worth saying plainly now, so that you will hear it again when it matters most. A thing that is paid attention to does not stay broken long. James had believed that. Cora had built her surviving on it. And Nathaniel Cray, without knowing the phrase, had been living it since before he arrived. The days moved forward the way November days move in hill country, fast toward the dark, the light thin and slanted and gone before you were ready. Cora measured the first weeks in tasks completed. Day 7, the winter wheat rows mulched against early frost. Day 9, the cattle shifted to the south pasture. Day 14, the orchard trees pruned and the cuttings bundled for kindling. He worked ahead of her list in a way that was not showing off, only efficient, and she found herself revising it each evening to account for what he had already done and what she had not thought to put on it. She learned things about him the way you learn things about someone you live and work near, not in conversation so much as in observation. He was left-handed and had compensated so thoroughly that you only noticed when he reached for something without thinking. He rose before her and had the barn fed and the fire laid before she came downstairs. Every morning, without having been asked, his quiet had a different quality from Elias Boone's habitual whistling. It was not vacant, it was occupied. He had lost someone. She knew this without being told, and did not ask how she knew. There is a particular relationship a person has with early mornings when they have lost someone, a deliberateness, a choosing to engage with the day before the day demands it, as if moving first keeps the grief from catching up. She recognized it because she did it herself. On the evening of the 17th day, he asked if he could see the east slope, the limestone shelf James had described. She showed him at first light, climbing the slope behind the orchard, while the frost was still white on the grass. The shelf was a long, flat ledge of gray stone above the creek hollow, and from it you could see the whole of the 80 acres laid out below. The house with its east-facing porch, the barn, the wheat fields in their winter cover, the orchard rows, the creek catching the early light in pieces. He stood there for a long time and said nothing. She stood beside him and said nothing. The cold was hard and clean, and they could see their breath. After a while he said he did it just as she said he usually did. They climbed back down and went to work. At the end of the 4th week, she found the letter. She had not known it existed. She was looking for the deed in the cedar chest in the bedroom where James had kept his papers, and beneath the deed was a letter in James's handwriting, dated March of 1883, 7 months before he died. She sat on the edge of the bed and read it. James had written it clearly, without apology. He wrote that if she was reading this, he hoped she had stayed on the land because the land was the best thing they had built together, and it would outlast grief if she gave it time. He wrote that he had told his friend Nathaniel Cray about the place, and that Nathaniel was the best worker he had known, and a good man in the way that the phrase meant something, rather than nothing, and that if Nathaniel ever came, she should let him stay. He wrote that he was not trying to arrange anything, only to leave her someone she could trust in a world where trust was the hardest thing to come by and the most necessary. He wrote that he loved her with a straightforwardness that made her press her hand flat against the page and breathe slowly for a while. At the bottom, in smaller writing, he had added, "There are 2 reasons Nathaniel might come. He will tell you the first one. He may not know the second himself yet. You will have to decide whether to tell him what it is." She folded the letter and put it back under the deed, and sat on the edge of the bed for a long time. She did not tell Nathaniel about the letter that day or the next. She thought about the second reason, the way you think about a splinter you cannot quite reach. Aware of it at odd moments, at the table, at the fence, on the east slope, in the thin morning light. She watched Nathaniel work and thought about what a man's second reason might be for traveling 3 days in November to a farm he had only heard described. She was careful not to conclude anything. She had learned that carefulness from 4 years of making decisions alone, that she could not afford to get wrong. On the 31st day, the first snow came. 4 inches overnight, dry and light, that stiffened the grass and capped the fence posts and made the orchard look like something from a different season entirely. Nathaniel had the cattle in the barn before she was dressed. By mid-morning they had worked through the storm together, breaking ice in the water trough, spreading extra bedding for the hogs, checking the wheat fields' cover against wind. The snow kept coming lightly all day, and they moved through it without discussing it, the way 2 people move through a task they have worked out the shape of together. At dusk, she heated soup, and he came in from the barn, and they ate at the kitchen table with the lamp between them. The windows were dark with snow reflection, and the house was warm. In the specific way it is warm when the cold outside is thorough, and the fire inside has been properly maintained. He said the mare's right foreleg needed watching, a small puff of heat above the knee, probably nothing but worth the attention. She said she had noticed it yesterday and had been meaning to mention it. He said he would poultice it in the morning. She said that would be good. That was the whole conversation over soup, but the quiet between sentences had changed. It was no longer the quiet of 2 people being careful with each other. It was the quiet of 2 people who have run out of the need to be careful and have not yet found a new name for what has replaced it. The warning came from the blacksmith in Harlan's Cross, a broad-shouldered man named Curtis Wade, who shod Cora's horses and kept his opinions to himself, except when they were necessary. He came out to the farm on the 8th of December, a Tuesday, arriving at noon with his coat collar turned up, and the expression of a man who has ridden 6 miles to say something he would rather not say. He told her that a man named Harlan Fitch had been in the county seat the week before. Fitch was from Nashville. He made a considerable sum buying distressed farm debts, converting them to liens, and pressing those liens until he owned the land outright, or the farmer paid double the original balance. What was unusual about his interest in Cora's 80 acres was that he was claiming James Aldridge had signed a promissory note in the winter of 1882 against a loan of $120, and that the note, sold twice since, was now Fitch's property. Curtis Wade said he did not know whether the note was genuine, but she should know it was being talked about in the county clerk's office before she heard it from Fitch himself. James had borrowed money in the winter of 1882. She knew that. They had needed a new hay mower. There had been a late mortgage payment, and the apple crop had come in short. James had arranged a private loan at a lender she had never met. She had known about the loan, had not known about a signed note, had not known the debt had been sold. The original sum was $120, and James had been paying it quarterly through 1883, and then he had died in October, and she had assumed, the way a person assumes a thing not in front of their face, that the lender had been paid from the estate. She had not verified it because the estate had been a small and exhausting thing to settle, and there had been more necessities than hours. She went inside and found James's account book in the cedar chest and went through it page by page. The loan was there. 3 quarterly payments through July of 1883. Then James had died and the payments had stopped. 9 years of accrued interest on a balance that was not $240 unless the rate had been usurious, which was not impossible. She looked up from the account book, and Nathaniel was in the doorway. He had come in from the barn and seen her face, and stopped. She told him what Curtis Wade had said, and what the account book showed, plainly, the way she had learned to present a problem, all the relevant facts in order, and no decoration. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he said, "Do you have the original loan agreement?" She said she did not know. He said, "Then we looked." They went through the cedar chest together, which was the first time she had let anyone look through James's papers, and found at the back of a folded survey map a single-page agreement signed by James Aldridge and a lender named R. Colquitt at an interest rate of 8% per annum. Nathaniel did the arithmetic at the kitchen table with a pencil stub and said the outstanding balance plus legitimate interest for 4 years was closer to $162. He said, "Fitch is adding a penalty that isn't in this agreement." She said, "I cannot afford $160 either." He said, "I know, but $160 is a debt. Those aren't the same problem." Harlan Fitch arrived on the 15th of December. He came with 2 hired men and a letter from a county clerk that he held in front of him, the way men hold official documents, when the document is meant to substitute for an argument. He was 50-ish, broad-faced, in a town coat, with the ease of a man who has been right enough times to stop considering that he might be wrong. He knocked twice, and Cora opened the door before he could knock a 3rd time, because she had been watching from the window. He framed it as a courtesy call. She had his interest at heart. If she could make good on the outstanding balance of $240 by the 1st of January, she would retain the deed without encumbrance. If she could not, there was a legal mechanism that could be handled with minimum disruption. He smiled through most of this. Nathaniel came around the corner of the house from the direction of the barn. He had a fence driver, which he set against the porch rail in a deliberate and visible way, and then stood. The two hired men looked at him and then at each other. She said, "Mr. Fitch, I have the original loan agreement. I have the interest rate in writing. I have my husband's payment record through July of 1883. The balance in arrears at legitimate interest is $162.40. The figure you named is not the debt." Fitch said the note had penalty provisions. She said the written agreement did not include penalty provisions, and she would be glad to show him the document. He said the original lender had communicated the terms verbally. She said she was not in a position to accept a verbal arrangement she had not witnessed as superseding a written agreement she had in hand, and she imagined a court would say the same. He looked at the fence driver against the porch rail. He said he would be in touch, in the tone of a man who means the conversation is not finished. She said she expected so, and closed the door. Inside, she stood with her back to the door and breathed once, slowly. Nathaniel came in from the porch. He said, "You did that well," she said. He said, "No, but the ground you're standing on is better than you thought this morning." The lawyer's name was Denton Sayer, a thin, precise man of 60 who had handled 3 generations of land transactions in the county and had no patience for manufactured debt. He reviewed the agreement and the account book and the arithmetic Nathaniel had done, confirmed the figure and the law, and said that Fitch would be gambling on her not being able to document the original terms. He would write a letter to the county clerk's office correcting the record and notify Fitch directly. He said he would do this for $25 against the possibility of a case worth bringing, with that sum to come out of any judgment in her favor. She paid him $10 as a retainer, and he accepted it without comment, which told her the $10 was probably sufficient for what she needed. She felt lighter on the drive back than she had felt in a month. She sat beside Nathaniel on the wagon seat, and the cold air came off the ridge, and the road was frozen hard enough to jar the wheels, and she thought about James's letter. The 2 reasons. What a person pays attention to when they have stopped being careful and have not yet named the replacement. On the 21st of December, the solstice and the longest night, she was in the kitchen mending a split in the leather of a harness collar, when Nathaniel came in from the barn and sat across the table and said, "I want to tell you something." She set the harness down. She waited. He said that when he had come in November, he had told her the first reason, that James had described the land and told him to come. There was a second reason he had not named, because he had not been sure it was right to name it. He had lost his wife in the spring of 1885, fever, 3 years of marriage, and no children. And when she died, he had understood that he could turn hard or he could stay careful, and he had decided to stay careful. But careful in a place where you have been grieved is not the same as careful in a new place, and he had needed a new place. He had had James's description for years and had not been ready before November. He said all of this without looking for a response in her face, simply putting the words on the table the way you put down something you have been carrying. She said, "James's letter said there were 2 reasons. He knew one. He left the other for me to figure out." Nathaniel was quiet for a moment. He said, "What did you figure out?" She said that you came for the land and you stayed for something else. And I think the something else is the same. Something else I have been pretending not to notice for 6 weeks. He said nothing. He looked at her. The lamp was between them and the solstice. Dark was complete outside the window, and the fire in the stove was doing the only work it knew. She said the job was spoken for before you got here, but there was nothing spoken for after that. He said, "I'm aware of that." She said so. He said so. That was the whole of it, the way a door opens that has been shut for a long time. Not dramatically, but with a simple shift of the latch. A thing that is paid attention to does not stay broken long. She would think of that phrase at this moment, years later, and understand it had been true longer than she had been applying it. That it had been true since a man in a Georgia mill had listened to a younger man describe a piece of land in Tennessee and had filed the description away. The $162, she had $68 in the wooden box under the bed. Nathaniel had what remained of 4 months' wages and some savings from Georgia, a deliberate man who had not spent what he did not need to spend. Together, on the morning of the 23rd of December, they counted the money on the kitchen table, and it came to $151.30. $11.10 short of $162.40. Cora wrote to her sister in Louisville, not asking for charity, but asking for a loan at fair interest with the terms in writing, because she had learned from James's account book and from Harlan Fitch, both what happened when terms were not written down. Her sister replied in 4 days, which was as fast as the post could carry a letter, and the reply included $12 and a note that said to keep the interest. Cora wrote back and said she would not keep the interest, that the terms were fair or they were nothing. And she set aside $2.50 per quarter to pay back the $12 plus a fair interest over 12 months, recording it in the account book under a heading that said, "What is owed and to whom." On the 28th of December, Denton Sayre met them at the county clerk's office in the county seat, and they paid $162.40 to the legal representative of the note, a junior associate of Fitch's operation who had the expression of a man expecting a different outcome. Sayre gave the clerk a corrected accounting and a copy of the original loan agreement and a letter he described to Cora as a preemptive correction of the record, meaning he told the county officially that Fitch had attempted to collect a penalty not present in the signed terms. He said it might not lead to consequences for Fitch, but would make the county clerk's office less welcoming to his instruments in the future, which was the kind of friction that mattered over time. They drove home in the early dark, the hills snow-covered, and the road quiet, and the mare's breath coming in slow clouds. Cora had the receipt in her coat pocket, and she put her hand on it once. Done with this particular thing, the 80 acres was hers the same way it had always been hers, completely, and at some cost and by choice. She said to Nathaniel, "There's something I should have asked you 3 weeks ago." He said, "You can ask it now." She said, "You don't have to stay. The position is paid through April, and you've earned every cent of it, and there's no obligation past that." She said, "So I'm not asking out of obligation." He said, "I know you're not. What are you asking?" She said, "I'm asking if you want to stay." on different terms than April. He was quiet for a count of seconds that felt longer. He said, "Different, how?" She said, "Permanent. The kind that gets written in a record somewhere, the way I prefer things to be." He said, "I prefer that too." She said, "Then yes." He said, "Yes," 2 words, each carrying everything the person saying it had been. They were married in the first week of January 1888 in the office of Denton Sayre, who was not an ordained minister, but was a justice of the peace, a fact Cora had not known until she asked. Curtis Wade stood as witness and shook Nathaniel's hand afterward, with the approval of a man who has been watching a situation develop and is satisfied with the result. The other witness was a woman named Beulah Kirby, who sewed for half the county and knew more about its residents than its minister did, and who would ensure that the record of the marriage was widely understood, which Cora had calculated was as useful as any legal filing. Harlan Fitch came back on the 9th of January with 3 men and a different letter from the county clerk's office, a notice of intent regarding a secondary claim involving a neighbor's grazing rights and a shared fence line documentation. The grazing rights claim was a different shape than the debt, more procedural, harder to refute immediately. Nathaniel stepped outside. Denton Sayre stepped outside behind him. Cora had sent for Sayre the previous week when Curtis Wade reported that Fitch was still in the county and still asking questions. Sayre had agreed to spend the day at the farm at a rate she thought more than fair, which told her he found Fitch worth opposing on principle. Sayre took the letter from Fitch's hand and read it and handed it back. He said, "This instrument references a grazing agreement between Aldridge and Pruitt from 1881, which you are representing as transferable. It is not transferable without the agreement of both original parties." Checkray. He used her new name without ceremony because it was simply accurate. He said, "Mrs. Cray does not agree to any transfer. The claim has no standing. Furthermore, I have filed a complaint with the State Bar Association regarding your representation of the original debt against this property, which misrepresented the penalty terms of a written agreement. I am prepared to present that filing to any court you choose." He said it in the same register a person uses to describe the weather, even and certain and indifferent to reception. Fitch looked at Cora. He looked at Nathaniel. He looked at the 3 men he had brought and evidently found them insufficient. He said something about the county having a long memory. Sayre said the county's memory was indeed long, which was why he had put everything in writing. Fitch folded the letter, put it in his coat pocket, turned his horse, and rode. His men followed without looking back. Curtis Wade, who had waited in the lane, drove up to the porch and said, "Is it done?" Cora said she believed it was. He nodded and said he would see them at the spring and drove back to town. It was done the way most things are done, not with a conclusion, but with a person choosing to go somewhere else and finding eventually. Fitch was not ruined. He was simply redirected. That was not justice in the clean sense the word implies. It was something more practical, the removal of a pressure that had been unsustainable. Cora would take that. The winter settled into itself in the weeks that followed. There were mornings she drove fence stakes alongside Nathaniel in a cold so solid it made sound brittle, and evenings they sat at the kitchen table, She with the account book, he with the feed records, both working in the lamp's reach. He had begun teaching her the names of things in the language his grandmother had spoken, a language he carried in fragments, the way you carry something partial and precious, carefully. She had begun teaching him the names James had given to different parts of the farm, private names that meant nothing on a map but oriented the people who lived there. The east slope was the overlook. The low corner of the south field was the wet room. The stand of cedars along the creek was the green fence. She gave him these names, and he received them without comment, and the next day she heard him refer to the overlook in conversation with himself, talking low to the mare as he worked, and she turned away before he could see that she had heard. Spring came the way it always came in hill country, grudgingly, and then all at once the creek high and copper-colored for a week, and then clear, the grass coming green in the south pasture, the orchard in a state of tremendous optimism. Nathaniel pruned the trees on the overlook side, and she hauled the cuttings, and they worked the south field's drainage, and planted the kitchen garden in a week of perfect weather in mid-April. The wheat came in. The hogs were heavy and complaining about it. On a morning in late April, she was in the barn and found him on his back under the hay wagon, doing something to the axle with a methodical patience she recognized as the posture of a person in the middle of understanding a problem. She said, "What is it?" He said, "Bolt's been backing out all winter. Fixed it in December, and it's backed out again. I'm putting a second lock nut on it, which I should have done in December." She said, "Is that a criticism of December?" He said, "It's a criticism of the bolt." She went back to what she was doing. But she was smiling, and he probably knew it. A thing that is paid attention to does not stay broken long. She said it to herself that morning in the barn, with the April light coming through the slat gaps in the wheat green in the south field, and the man under the wagon correcting what he should have corrected months before. And the phrase had a different weight than it had carried when she first said it to herself. Standing in the north pasture with the October sky enormous above her, and James, 4 days buried, and the fence still needing the post he had been carrying. Then it had been a way to keep moving. Now it was a description of what had happened to her, and to him, and to the 80 acres, and to the ordinary and irreplaceable practice of being alive. They stood together on the overlook that evening, the long limestone shelf above the creek hollow, and the light was doing what it does at that hour in Tennessee, turning the ridge to bronze and the creek to copper, and the whole visible world into something that looked, briefly, like an argument for its own continuation. She had been coming to this place since 1879. She knew every angle of it. But standing here beside Nathaniel, she was aware that the view had expanded in a direction that had nothing to do with geography. James, who named his troubles only to strangers, and carried his heaviness in private, and died in the north pasture with a fence post in his arms, had known something about his friend, and something about his wife, and something about the distance between them, and he had done the only thing available to a man who sees ahead from a limited position. He had left a description of a place and trusted the right person to find it. He had written a letter that began as practical instruction and ended as understanding. He had said, "There are 2 reasons." He had trusted Cora to recognize the second one when it arrived, in a man who stayed careful, who kept his horse well, who rose before light and did not announce himself, who had learned, as she had learned, that grief is not a thing you finish, but a thing you carry differently over time, until the day you realize your hands are occupied with something else, and have been for a while. She thought of him that evening on the Overlook, not with the sharp particular pain that had been her companion for 4 years, but with something gentler and more honest. The way you think of someone who did something kind for you that you only fully understood later. "Thank you, James," she thought. "You always did describe it right." Nathaniel stood beside her with his hands in his coat pockets and the last light going across the ridge. And he said, "Good land." She said, "3 days." He said, "Every mile of it." She looked at the 80 acres below them, the house with its east-facing porch, the orchard in its spring ambition, the wheat fields tender and certain, the creek making its way along the limestone shelf with the pragmatic persistence of water. The creek did not know anything about the year or the winter or Harlan Fitch or promissory notes or the difference between obligation and love. It simply moved through the country it belonged to, because belonging had never been complicated for it. Things that go together tend to find their way together, given enough time. That was the other truth this place had taught her, slow and cumulative, and finally on this April evening, with the light leaving the ridge, and the man beside her belonging to the farm as thoroughly as the limestone shelf belonged to it, impossible to argue with. She did not say any of this. She put her hand into the crook of his arm, and they stood there until the light was gone, and the first stars appeared over the eastern ridge, and the creek below them was a sound in the dark. And then they went down together to the house, where the fire needed banking, and the account book was open on the table, and the lamp waited, and the morning was going to come early, as it always did, as it always would,